name's Keith Miller. Like he said, I run the Missoula Real Estate Meetup. I'm a real estate investor and developer. So a little bit, I guess, about myself. I've got a 5 and 7-year-old boy, beautiful wife, obviously. And so I'm actually a 5th generation Montanan, born and raised in Missoula. And so I'm going to try to focus today. I'll obviously be touching on my story because that's part of the process. I'm going to try to make this as useful and actionable for you guys as possible, because I think my story inherently, obviously you learn a lot of lessons along the way, and so I'm going to try to share as many of those as possible. And so I'm going to jump right in. So my title, from public school teacher to real estate developer, building a company one project at a time. Okay, let's get into it. So, like I said, I'm from Missoula. So ended up, born and raised in Missoula, but then I ended up getting a swimming scholarship out in upstate New York. Moved out to Boston, followed my now wife out there for a few years. Had a really good time there. So I got a history degree and then a master's degree in history, and I was really passionate about teaching. Closing the achievement gap, especially, working with very low income, mostly Hispanic kids in Boston. Really enjoyed that for a long time. Ended up being 6 years, had our first kid, wanted to move back to family, and I wanted to move back to Montana anyway. Just take one step back, bought a condo in 2013 in Boston, an up and coming neighborhood, so that I could walk to school, which ended up being both a great thing for life, but also ended up being a great investment. Put some money into that condo, held it for 5 years, and that sort of was the seed money that started it all. And I think that's one of my takeaways is get started, start building equity, start getting on that appreciation track, because that is the sort of snowball that leads to everything else after that. And so to be clear, it wasn't just it was a condo that I believe the mortgage at the time was $1,200 or something. It was a very small condo, but it was a 2-bedroom. And as my wife and I were married, we still got a roommate who paid $800 a month. And so me and my wife were paying, what was it, $200 each or something. And so that ended up you can call that house hacking, but we did that repeatedly throughout. We actually still had roommates as we had our first kid. And so having that sort of side income was really crucial, especially, I was a middle school social studies teacher. I wasn't making a lot of money. And that's, I think, an important context. I'm not a real estate investor that was had a lot of cash to invest at all times. I was bootstrapping constantly and trying to figure out, how do I get to the next stage? How do I take the next step? And so luckily I was able to return to Montana. We had a choice between, parents in Florida or parents in Missoula. I'm so grateful to this day that we were able to do Montana. So I got really dedicated to financial independence, and that was part of the reason we bought our condo in 2013. But then especially moving back here, and I'll get into the story of what happened when we moved back, but we saw this enormous rise in property values, obviously. From 2019 to today, the median Montana home has doubled in price. And so that has had a very significant impact on affordability and the ability for people to live in this state. And so I think that's one question that I've always returned to is how do we allow people to live in this state? Because the median wages have not gone up that much. And this is what I'm going to speak about here is this is from 2024 technically, but it showed that in the gap between median wages and the median housing price, Montana was worse than Hawaii. It was worse than California. It was the worst in the entire nation, which is really remarkable. Because you think about this 5 years ago, nobody would have predicted this. Montana was not on the radar of most, being the affordability, last in the nation. And so that was one thing that sort of got me passionate about trying to solve this issue is something needs to be done, or this could even get worse. And so we are experiencing this housing gap in Montana. The workforce can't buy homes, and what happened is when you get a rapid rise in property values, land gets way more expensive. And I think especially you see this in a place like Bozeman, land got way more expensive all of a sudden. And so if your land costs go way up, and you then have to sell, and your build costs go up, right? Because building got really expensive. Then all of a sudden, the only thing you can build is very high-end Class A rentals to make your pro forma work. That's kind of the only thing you can do. Or, high-priced for sale homes. And so it's like you get into this high construction cost, high land cost cycle that requires you to sell a home for $650, $850 or whatever to make it work. But how are you supposed to get into your first home when it's $650, or in Bozeman's case, $950 or whatever? So, and it's hard to bridge that gap. And one of the only ways to do it is like at a large scale, with very large development, but it's hard for small investors, which I would put myself in that category to bridge that gap. And so there's a massive need for these more attainably priced homes, and it's just really hard to build. Okay, so I decided to take action on this. That's me and my dad after I was blowing cellulose up into the attic of that tiny, very low profile roof. And so as a guy who's 6'3", that was like one of the tightest fits getting around rafters and stuff. I'm going to talk about what's worked for me. I'm going to share as much about what I've learned and lessons learned from each of these projects to try to make it actionable and useful for you guys. Lessons learned. Okay, so I think I might have missed this context. In 2022, so 3.5 years ago, I ended up teaching middle school social studies for 10 years. Got pretty burnt out by the transition back to Montana. I sort of went from this like very small, very highly motivated group of like 25-year-old teachers to like thrown into a regular classroom where everybody's isolated and you sort of don't really have nearly as much of a community. And then COVID hit, and that got much worse. And so I had a hard time with that transition, got pretty burnt out on teaching. And so I went full-time into real estate 3.5 years ago, and I'll explain sort of how I made that transition. And for those of you guys who are, trying or looking to make that transition, it was one of the most exciting and awesome decisions of my life, and also one of the most scariest. And so we'll talk about how to try to navigate that if that's a goal of yours. Okay, so sold the condo in 2017 and moved back to Montana. So we had some capital to work with, okay? And so what we did was we bought this house in the top right-hand corner, nice little neighborhood in Missoula, and then had this two-car garage, detached two-car garage, okay? And so we ripped it down to the studs, and I did pretty much all of the work myself. There was a couple of things like drywall that I was just like, let's just get this done. Most of the other, I didn't do any plumbing and electrical at that point, because I want to be clear, I had no construction experience. I did not know what I was doing, and bootstrapping as much as I could, using my contacts as much as I could, hiring people when I needed to, and got it to this sort of, one bedroom, one bath, cute little ADU, standalone ADU. So that now brings in $1,470 a month. The house brings in $3,000 a month, which is awesome. And so lessons I learned was that sweat equity works. There's a lot of things in real estate construction that, material costs are like, for example, tiling. Tiling is like 15% the tiles itself, and it's like 85% the labor. And so if you can plug yourself into that labor equation and do that nights and weekends, you can get an enormous return on investment, because tile looks great and it lasts, especially if you're a buy and hold or build and hold investor like I am. Like, tile holds up really well. And so it's kind of one of those ideal things that you can do if you can, if you can figure it out. And that's, I guess, my second lesson learned is YouTube. It really does work. It's like, it's not rocket science. A tile saw is, a couple $100. The tiles are then a couple $100 more, and then all of a sudden you can have a beautiful backsplash, for example, and that's really all there is to it. Your first tile job may not look quite as good, but the other thing that has worked for me, and so this is like party board siding, lap siding. I'd never done any siding at all. I'd barely done any, construction at all. But I posted on Craigslist, I was like, looking for a sider to teach me how to side. And I ended up getting this great guy who actually, I think he's working down in Big Sky these days. And he just came, and I sided with him for like 2 days. And we got about halfway done, and then I finished the rest of it myself. And I just simply paid him by the hour. He was a really hard-working guy. We crushed it for a couple of days, and then I was able to finish myself. And so with a fairly reasonable cost, I all of a sudden then had the skill of siding. Obviously not in all situations, and My siding may not have looked quite as good as his, but we got it over the finish line. And so I think, don't be afraid. And this is where the networking, I think, comes in handy, is like, if you can start building up a network of tradespeople that you feel comfortable saying like, hey, can I hire you for like a day and you just come like teach me how to do this thing? All of a sudden, then you've completed that task, but then you've built your own skills to be able to do it the next time. Thank you so much, sorry. So, finished that ADU, we did some improvements, and just to be clear actually, the other thing I did, what I look for in houses is a back door that goes directly into the stairs downstairs, okay? So the first thing I did was build a terrible door and small wall section. I went back years later, I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. But it successfully blocked off the downstairs so that we could get a Airbnb. So we started Airbnb in the basement of our home, house hacking, continued house hacking. And that paid most of our mortgage. Once we finished the ADU, we got a home equity line of credit on our home and it was a cash out refinance. We did a cash out refinance because rates had dropped, pulled out a bunch of equity, and then immediately bought this home, okay? Which also happened to have a doorway right here that went right downstairs. And then we could build another wall and all of a sudden start renting out the downstairs. And so I did essentially the same thing again. Did some improvements. So this was the kitchen when COVID hit, and then this was the kitchen like a year later. So we basically just, it's like all of a sudden my personally, and certainly had a privileged position. I went from teaching full time to all of a sudden the district was like, you should send home 45 minutes of homework once per week. And that was literally it. It was March, obviously. So then I had the summer after that too. So I was like, well, just gonna start crushing it. I learned from YouTube and other things how to pour a concrete countertop and how to refinish cabinets and put in flooring and obviously tile the backsplash. And so I did a bunch of things like that. Switched from these like skinny posts to some big chunky, nicer looking ones that I stained. And I did the, tongue and groove ceiling on the back patio and the front patio and stuff. Just a couple of things like that, put some extra insulation in the ceiling. And so, put in a new kitchen downstairs so we could start renting the downstairs, not just as an Airbnb with a hot plate, but an actual rental. And so that all worked out very well. The other reason I bought this was it was a 12,000 square foot lot. And so it was zoned to allow up to 3 units. And so I wasn't quite ready to tackle that. I was like, I'm going to do the house first, and then we'll start figuring out the backyard. But it was a very much intentional decision to say, let's see what we can do here. So adding a unit is a big win always. If you can put something in a basement or chop off part of the house and add another unit that way, like that almost always, it doesn't quite double your rental income on a property, but it can get pretty close. And so design matters. If you have a wife with better taste than you, let her choose the tile and all that stuff. And also just like be a good landlord, and this is, I think, has to do with like responsiveness to inquiries. If you're responding really fast and you're setting up tours quickly, you're going to get more tenants. And so just to be clear, like we didn't sell the previous house, we started renting it out. And so it's like we started slowly gaining more units. I was obviously doing all the managing of that myself. Slowly building up units and being really responsive and quick to solve problems for your tenants builds a more stable tenant base and gets tenants in the door quicker. And so that was one of my other lessons learned here. And so the big backyard, eventually pushed it through, got 2 backyard townhouses approved. And so once, we slowly pushed the permit through the city of Missoula. It took a long time. School had started back up again at this point, so I was back to teaching by the time we got approved. But I ended up being the acting general contractor for the build. And so doing that as a full-time teacher was really tough. I want to be clear. That was one of my lessons learned, is like, if you have a job, you can't like pop out and go check in with a sub, maybe you shouldn't be GC. I'll say that. I would advise caution in that, unless you really want to get after it. And so it's like, those are, if you have a job that you are able to pop out much more easily, then I think it's easier to swing that. But built this during COVID. I think I bought my lumber at the peak of the most expensive, you know. It is what it is. I mean, fundamentally though, it's like, at the end of the day, I built it for about $350K and they appraised for $700K. So it's like, okay, still works out. Even if you're, you know, it's like, there are a lot of ways to cut down your costs, and, you know, acting as your own GC is one of them. That wouldn't have changed the numbers that significantly, but I also wanted to learn the process and control as much as I could, do a little bit of work where I can. So the other lesson learned that I haven't mentioned yet is, you know, ask your community for help. And this is, at this point, I was running the Missoula Real Estate Meetup, and I was actively networking, I was actively building relationships, I was, you know, finding mentors and actively asking mentors for help, like showing them the plans of this townhouse, like, is this going to work, you know? And they'd be like, yeah, this should pencil. Okay, great. I'm gonna ask 2 more people to make sure, but, you know, using the community and also leveraging them for, well, especially with sub shortages and having a hard time finding contractors, that was having that network ended up saving my butt several times. You know, people flake out, people don't show up, or shoddy work is done. You need to scramble and figure out a solution. So, other lesson learned: be humble and polite, especially when working with the city, trying to push a permit through. Keep following up very politely and do what you can. The other thing, and so we split this into 3 lots, and so the original home is on its own lot, and each townhouse is on its own lot, so they can be sold separately in the future. And it also just made financing those homes easier from a commercial equity standpoint. And so did a cash out, I think it was a home equity line of credit on the original house, and then a HELOC on each one of the townhouses. So we pulled equity out of all 3 properties at that point because they gained a lot, obviously. And part of this is the appreciation that happened, but part of this is the sweat equity that we had put in. And so we were able to pull out equity and then roll it into this next home. And this is my current primary residence. That's what it looked like up there on the right. Resided, you know, changed basically all the surfaces on the outside and most of the surfaces on the inside. Basically, the window frames, I think, are the only thing we didn't touch. And so this was only a 2-bedroom home when we bought it. Put in some, 2 egress windows to make it a 4-bedroom. Combined, these were 2 detached garages that sat butt to butt. It was kind of a weird thing, so there was a 2-foot gap in between them. Poured a slab in between those, combined them into a 2-bedroom, 1-bath ADU. And so that ended up working, certainly. That's, I believe, rented out for $1,700 today. It's my personal mortgage is $2,600, and the ADU pays for $1,700 of that. And so it's when you can bring income into your personal residence, good things start happening. Sorry guys about my throat. So I always add insulation to the homes I live in, just to add with efficiency. I mean, I like to save on my bills. And so lessons learned, I guess I already mentioned this, but politeness, follow through are key to permitting. The 1% rule can be exceeded with ADUs. This total conversion was $130K, and it brings in $1,700 a month. That exceeds the 1% rule and the 1% rule, if you're not familiar, is simply what is the monthly rent to the total cost. And so it's ideally, it's pretty hard to hit these days in Montana to hit the 1% rule. I haven't been able to do it. If you're gonna buy a home and start renting it out, you're not gonna get anywhere close to a 1% rule. But with sort of this backyard development model and infill development model, it is possible. And just persistence, at this point, doing a lot of the work myself and just keep pushing forward. Okay, so, and this is when I started sort of, branching out a little bit. And so this was a 5-plex in East Missoula that I bought with an investor. And so one of the units was a 6-bedroom, 2-bath, 1-kitchen unit. We actually added 1 more bedroom. Rehabbed the kitchen a little bit, found a lot of deferred CapEx hidden behind walls that the inspector did not find, but that's part of the process. And so, lessons learned: have a larger reserve fund than you think you will, for sure. Frequent updates to investors is key, especially if things are not going as planned. Supply trends, and this is where, if you're thinking what was happening during this time, this was 2022. at the time, the 6-bedroom, we were getting $4,500 a month at one point, which more than paid for the entire units, more like commercial loan payment, which was awesome. And then there was 4 more units above that, which was great. And so we were doing very well for a while. But as more Class A rentals were hitting the market, a lot of that supply was going way up. And so as 24 hit, all of a sudden supply was way higher, and you didn't need a GC didn't need a not very nice, to be clear, apartment with 6 bedrooms for his siding crew anymore, or his framing crew. And so all of a sudden, this very unique unit can be a lot harder to fill as supply rises. And so that was one challenge we ran into. Keep an eye on the supply trends and what's in the pipeline. It's like we are, I think, especially in Bozeman and Missoula right now, we're seeing an oversupply of apartments right now. A lot has hit the market over the last year or two, and so you're seeing supply up, and as a consequence, demand goes down. But depending on the market, you're also then, it's like, okay, well, what's coming next then, okay? In 2023, people were not pulling the trigger on big multifamily units as a general trend, at least in places like Missoula, and I believe Bozeman. I guess I'm not as familiar with what the development pipeline looks like here, but I think what we're seeing is that in Missoula, the pipeline is a lot more narrow. There's less that's going to hit the market over the next few years, and so just keep an eye on that, because that's a very important trend line that you have to keep an eye on. Okay, so big lessons learned from this. Resourcefulness and grit, use your network, keep pushing. That's the only way this was all possible. Partnering is the key to scaling, and especially as someone coming from a teaching background not with a lot of wealth, if you want to go further, partnering up is the best way to do so. Holding on to the rentals was my key, and so we ended up with. And just to be clear, we kept all of these, and so at this point I have 7 rental units with my primary residence as well, and so that was sort of how I was able to leave teaching was that replacement income. Relationships can save you, absolutely. Go to your meetups. I'd highly recommend it. Maybe I'm biased, but it's been very influential and helpful for my growth. Not just from since I have a relationship and you're a GC, you can help me with contacts, but also just mindset. Being around people that are trying to do the same thing is absolutely crucial to success, and that's certainly been borne out in my experience. Reinvesting profits in the next one. So this was, my whole strategy was make improvements, roll into the next one. Make improvements, roll in the next one. Or build something, roll any equity into the next one. And as much as possible. That's how the snowball builds and starts rolling faster. The other thing I sort of came to realize throughout this process is economies of scale matter. When I did all of these projects, you have to excavate, you have to bring in your sewer line, you have to connect to the water line, you have to do stormwater management. And if at the end of all that, you get 1 unit out of it, now don't get me wrong, it's worked for me, but a 200 unit multifamily also usually has 1 sewer connection and 1 water connection. And so these big costs, and it's for example, civil engineering. The civil engineering for these townhouses is not that much less than a much larger project. And so it's that was one of my takeaways, is this economies of scale matter, and going larger ends up with a more attainably priced product. So turning this experience into a scalable model. I talked a little bit how COVID burnt me out, had momentum, and so I left the classroom 3.5 years ago. And so this is my current partner, Ryan Fry. He's been a GC for 25 years and a developer. And so we, essentially created Upslope once I left teaching, and but focus on scaling. Is that yes? Because that's primarily a lot of his experience had been infill development as well. Larger projects than mine certainly, but not as large as we ended up going. And that was one of his big lessons learned, is that these costs, your costs don't scale as fast as your potential profits. And so it's the larger you go, the larger the gap can be between your costs and your ultimate profit. So had the time to build a business from the foundation up, which was great. You know, we spent a lot of time in due diligence figuring out exactly what are the projects we want to go to, what is the niche we're going to focus on. Originally focused sort of on tiny home communities and really went deep on that. The biggest issue is like, it works for cheap housing. It's just it's mostly the end buyer financing that you have an issue with, is that you can't really get like down payment assistance on a tiny house. You can't really get like 30-year fixed rate mortgages on a tiny house. Like, there's just several issues with that model. You know, you can build a home for $130K, which is great, but like there's associated problems that come with that development model. And so we sort of focus on more modular and manufactured homes, which come with a lot of the same advantages, you know, speed, cost control, risk reduction. Because especially my partner, you know, he'd been doing it for 25 years, and then COVID hit, and he was like, this situation makes me feel like an amateur. He's like, I can't get subs to show up, I can't hit my deadlines. Like, he was just very frustrated with the context of building during COVID. And he's like, there's gotta be a better way to do this. And so that's sort of where I was like, you know, well, let's look at these models that are just built in a factory, and 80% of it is done in a factory, and then it just gets dropped off on a lot. You have some work to do at the end, but 80% of your work is done. So that was really appealing to us. And sort of what we ended up focusing on is, you know, still, when you hear the term manufactured home, you're usually thinking on a lease lot, but you can just as easily put it on an ownership lot. So that's what we focus on, because we're big leaders in home ownership, you know, and so buyers will own the land. This is a build to sell model that we're focused on, where, you know, you get returns more. And because there's generally two strategies in real estate. You're either building equity and cash flow, or you're trying to build cash. Okay, and so like, you know, it's like, so far the story I've been telling you is more of the building equity and cash flow model, but I've since transitioned, partially because my W-2 income is now gone, to more of a cash generation, but because, and then you're always sort of pivoting between those two things depending on where you're at. And a lot of times investors will go through phases where it's like, okay, now I'm in more cash generation, now I need to switch, you know, then I can start investing that into more equity and cash flow. And sort of navigating those two like poles, I guess you could call them. So focus on entry-level housing, because we believe there's an enormous demand for it, that it's needed. Have the time to build deep knowledge. I can tell you, most of you guys are doing real estate, or I don't know, I guess. I believe most of you are doing real estate on the side, like nights and weekends, depending on your context. It's hard because you're putting most of your time and effort towards your full-time job. I can tell you that you can make a lot more progress when you can focus all your time and energy on your main thing, on real estate. But it still took a lot of time. Many promising projects fell through. Thought I had one in Livingston, for example. Just some things like that. Most development projects don't work out because in your due diligence you find something, because there's about 100 ways they can fall apart in early due diligence, because there's simply so many question marks, but you have to sort of march through to figure out, is this project going to work? So eventually found a great project in Great Falls. This is our third partner, Spencer Roy. He owns a civil engineering firm in Great Falls in Missoula. Brought him in as a partner, and that's, I guess, one of my lessons learned is like, don't be afraid to share equity to increase the chances of success. Grit and perseverance are key, certainly. It took a lot of perseverance to get to where we're at. And I'll just tell you a little bit, this is our current project. So we have a fully approved 163 home community up in Great Falls. Have a market study, all that stuff. And so using factory built homes in a sort of phase sales model, like phase 1 is 43 homes, but focus on real home ownership. And so our lessons learned is that, relationship building is key. Spent years in Great Falls building relationships with those, the economic development group and the city and, community partners and the nonprofits there. And so it will always take longer than you'd like. That's the other lesson learned. And simply copy what best investors are doing. And I say that, I do this constantly. It's like, when I'm looking, it's like, great, let's look at what other developers are doing with factory-built homes on ownership models. And I'll look at a community in Sequim, Washington, or one out in Hagerstown, Maryland, and sort of bounce around. And there are very few things in real estate that are 100% unique. If you ever find yourself doing something that is 100% unique in real estate, I would stop doing it personally, because that means like you're really out on the bleeding edge. Because there's about 10,000 different markets across the nation. And so if somebody's probably doing the same thing you're trying to do somewhere, find out, ideally, somebody who's already done it and made some mistakes, talk to them, give them a call. I regularly will cold call people who are doing this, either doing what I'm trying to do or something that I would like to do. Send them an email, send them a letter, and just see if you can chat with them for a few minutes. And you'll oftentimes learn a lot. And then all of a sudden you have a relationship, somebody to call when you're looking for a loan broker, or have a specific question about how to skirt the home in a specific way. If you can start building these relationships, the leverage points are significant. So my lessons learned, never stop learning, whether it's podcasts, books, all that stuff. Patience, process, long-term thinking. Real estate is not a get-rich-quick scheme. At least in my experience, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes years. Education, there's just not that great of real estate education out there. It's like a lot of it you have to do yourself. It's finding mentors. Don't be afraid to cold call or cold email or send a cold letter to somebody in your market who's doing something cool. And just say, introduce yourself and be like, this is what I'm focused on, or this is what I'm trying to do. Would you mind if I came to your office and asked you a few questions? The worst thing they can do is not respond, which sometimes they will. Oftentimes they will. But a couple people will respond, and then all of a sudden you've got a relationship, you've got somebody to talk to. Reading books, taking action, that's what it takes. So learn small before go big. I wouldn't start with a large project. You're going to have to, start where you're at. Protect capital through cost control and clarity. Those dollars count at every stage. Control the best you can. Build relationships before raising money, for sure. And mission drives momentum. Being passionate about what you're doing is going to lead to a lot more success. And so it's if you're feeling a real hunger or attraction to a certain aspect of the market or niche, listen to that. Do some more research. Dive deeper. Okay, so homes don't fall out of the sky, and I think that's one thing that I'm a big believer in, is there's an iron law in housing. It's supply and demand. If we want things to be more reasonably priced, there has to be more supply. So I think a lot of people in this room are part of that solution. I know a lot of people are adding value by adding units or splitting up a larger home. That's a very common strategy, and Montana needs that. So start with one property, one partnership. Oh. There we go. Okay. Start with one property, one partnership, one idea. Pursue it best you can. For investors, align your capital with project to create return and value. And let's build some more housing. So I do have a list of books that have been influential and helpful for me. I'm happy to share that. That's my email if you want to shoot me an email. I don't have an assistant. I will see it. Okay. That's about it for my presentation. Let me just hit this before our question and answer.